And indeed he did say that. I hasten to say, so that we don't sort of veer into hagiography here, that I disagreed with him a lot on a lot
Yeah.
of things, and I think he got a lot of things incredibly wrong.
Let's talk about some of those.
Yeah, I want to give the biggest one was the Iraq War
Yep.
in 2003. He was totally against the first Gulf War, the liberation of Kuwait, which I think you could make a case for, right? At least in terms of international law, and
Yeah.
also in terms of it being a successful policy that tried to do something very simple and with limited means, and it did it, and then it stopped, and that's sort of an effective use of military force. Whether you agree with it or not, it's another story. But what George H.W. Bush wanted to, and Brent Scowcroft and James Baker wanted to achieve, they did achieve, and and so it's almost like Putin in Syria. It's not, you can get into the morality of it, but did they get what they wanted at a limited cost? Yes, and you can argue the merits. Whereas I think the war he was for in Iraq, right, the 2003 invasion, was not only ill-conceived from the beginning, it's been a catastrophe for just about everybody. I think we'll have to wait another 100 years or 50 years before we know whether on a net basis it was a benefit to Iraqis or not.
That became his argument, right? His argument was that if we didn't intervene, then the Saddam regime was going to collapse and it'd be a black hole. Of
Well,
course, he died before ISIS
yeah,
became the black hole anyway, kind of.
look, he was never going to take it back.
Yeah.
I think he came to see that this wasn't all it was cracked up to be, and I think he was attached to his mistake so much that he was not going to be able to climb down from it. And I think towards the end he knew that he had been wrong, but I think it was very hard for him to admit that. This is my feeling. I don't know. I will say this. I think his real reason for being in favor of the Iraq War, and I think there was a real reason, a core reason, an impenetrable reason, which was one he did not, you could see it clearly if you looked very, very carefully and you knew him well. From the distance, you would not get this impression, because he used to pull out all kinds of arguments, many of them absurd and specious, in his debates in favor of the war, both before and after. And I used to have terrible arguments with him, but I know what was driving his support above all. And it wasn't the religious thing, because Saddam he would use religion, but he was fundamentally not, I wouldn't call him secular, but he was basically in a kind of, quasi-fascist military dictator.
Hitchens had a go at trying to turn him into a religious.
Yeah,
but it didn't really stick.
It doesn't really work. Yeah, it really wasn't true. I mean, he in desperation would throw around religious imagery, but he didn't believe it. In the end, what was driving Hitchens' support for this invasion was his sense that it would be good for the Kurds.
Yeah.
And I think he felt a terrible burden. He was always very pro-Kurdish and also pro-Palestinian and pro-Greek Cypriot. And but he was especially and above all pro-Kurdish.
Yeah.
And you'll see that he used to go around with a little pin on his jacket all the time in his flag. Yeah, it was a Kurdish pin, right? The flag of the KRG. And he was, particularly sympathetic to the Jalal Talabani faction, but actually all of them. He loved Barham Saleh, who's now the president of Iraq. He was, liked him a lot. And I think he felt that the West owed the Kurds an intervention that undid the damage of the treaties that were, especially the Treaty of Sèvres, and some of the others, San Remo and others, that denied Kurds an independent state after the First World War, when it had been planned for. and basically broke Kurdistan up into most of it going to Turkey, but big parts going to Iraq and other smaller parts to Iran and Syria. And that this had been a totally unacceptable betrayal, and it had to be reversed. In the meanwhile, you get rid of the monster Saddam, you undercut fascism and fanaticism in the Middle East. Hopefully, you create a democracy, but above all, you do something to really help empower Kurds. And I think from that point of view, it was not unsuccessful.
What endeared him so much to the Kurds? Was it the underdog thing? Was it friendships? Was it the idea that they?
I think it was the underdog thing. I think it was a carryover from his socialist and Trotskyist days, because the Kurdish issue was very popular in the 70s and 80s among Trotskyites and Trotskyists, and Maoists as well. And the sense that this was essentially not only a beleaguered and abused people, but also that their movements were fundamentally secular, that there was either a liberal or even better, a left, because in the end, I don't think Hitchens ever fully left the left. I think his dying words were capitalism downfall. That was the last things he said. And that indicates that he had not really ever abandoned and I know he didn't. I think, he was certainly not a Bolshevik, and I don't think he was a political Marxist either, but he was certainly, I think, people who thought he'd become a conservative were getting him wrong. So I think it was the Kurdish issue was one, and full disclosure, I'm of Kurdish origin. I'm from a Lebanese and Syrian Kurdish family, but it doesn't really matter. It was not a big issue between us, and I was more of an Arab American, activist at the time. Yeah. But the point is, I think it was an affiliation that he got, like the pro-Palestinian affiliation in his left-wing days. And I think it carried over much more seamlessly into when he became sui generis, no longer with the left, identifiably, and, on friendly terms with the neoconservative right, but not a right-winger at all because of religion and because of not believing in, capitalism and things like that. I think that it was the most seamless transition. I think he found the Kurds the most sympathetic of these historical victims, the most deserving, the biggest, the largest group, the ones who really had been wronged by the West.
Well, he was right about all of that.
Of course. Yeah. You can look at the Tibetans and say, well, yes, but the West didn't really screw them. They've been preyed upon by the Chinese, and that's history from. It's not that the West didn't facilitate or arrange for the Chinese invasion of Tibet, and but the Kurdish thing goes directly to the Western powers after World War I and until this day, and so there's all of that, and I think it became something you could do something about, right? You may sympathize with the Palestinians, but what are you going to do about it? Whereas in this case there was a means, and I think one of the reasons that he got along well with the neoconservatives in the post 9/11 era, and before, but especially in the post 9/11 era, is he recognized neoconservatism has its origins in disaffected Trotskyists, right? Yeah. And left-wing anti-communists, as in anti-Stalinists, right?
Yep.
And as the Irving Kristols and Norman Podhoretzes of this world. And I think that
even Tony Blair's to some extent, right?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. And people would say, and Hitchens, but that's not right. But there is this idea of political evangelical internationalism, right? And I think he never gave up on that idea of using power to spread enlightenment, liberalism internationally, to spread democracy and rationalism and freedom and human rights, as in the droit de l'homme and as in the Declaration of Independence and whatnot, that kind of rationalist view of human rights, expansive, universal, anti superstition, humanist, all of that stuff. And so I think he saw in the post 9/11 neoconservative surge into Iraq, a potential for doing that through an unlikely group of people, which is, sort of Wolfowitz, Cheney, Rumsfeld, et cetera. And I had dinner with Wolfowitz a couple of times in Hitchens' house. It was very interesting.
Yeah.
So I think that, he saw that through, in effect, a kind of neo-Trotskyist lens.
In 1996, the interview I was talking about, he said this, and I jotted it down. He was talking about American hegemony.
Yeah.
And he said, even at its worst, it has within itself somehow the germ of a different society.
Yeah.
He was, so even, this was, right for the nation. He was by no means thought of as a neoconservative at that point, I don't think.
96, he was still thoroughly on the left.
5 years before 9/11. Yeah, thoroughly on the left, but he was still thinking that way. And he would talk about how Marx would make, in his writing, similar disclosures about the British Empire or things like that. So I suppose there is really a thread running.
There is a thread.
Straight through.
There definitely is a thread. And it's also there in the seamless transition between the left-wing Trotskyist internationalism of the people who became neoconservatives, beginning with James Burnham. James Burnham's transition from being a core member of the inner circle of the Trotskyists, close to Trotsky himself, and Conrad Burnham, that Trotsky would quarrel with, in 2 years of leaving the Trotskyist movement, he was a hardcore American imperialist, like the template for the neoconservatives. It was a seamless transition, and it wasn't more than 2 years, 3 years. Towards just before the beginning of the Second World War, he's breaking decisively with Trotsky and with the left, and by 43, he's a full-on right-wing internationalist, American imperialist. There's no other word for him. And it's such a seamless transition that it suggests that in the Venn diagram, there's quite a bit of gray area there.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Those two circles. And I think you can see that in the Irving Kristol's and Norman Podhoritz's and all those. And you can see it in Hitchens, not that he became a neoconservative, but that he became very comfortable with neoconservatism as a foreign policy orientation when it was very aggressively in the democracy spreading role. Now, the question is, how much were they really trying to do that? But that's what Hitchens wanted. That's as long as he was conceptualizing it that way. So I think there are moralistic neoconservatives. Wolfowitz is a good example, who genuinely believes all this.
He was the real deal. He was the closest to Hitchens, right, of the neoconservatives.
Yeah. And he really, I know him, he does believe it. He absolutely, he's sincere. And then people who just use that rhetoric as a vehicle for power, and I think the key example of that is Cheney.
Yeah.
And also to some extent Rumsfeld. They don't really, this democracy stuff is just, so much.
It was nearest at hand, yeah.
It was a great excuse for going and clobbering the enemy. But those are very different ways of looking at it. And it sounds the same, but you can tell. So I don't think he ever had much use for Cheney and Rumsfeld, but he liked, he felt very comfortable with the moralistic neoconservatives like Wolfowitz.
Why do you think that the neoconservatives, not the cynical ones, but the real ones,
the true believers,
the true believers, why are they wrong ultimately? What's their weak spot?
Well, I think that the whole idea of moralistic evangelical internationalism is wrongheaded. Right. I'm not part of this group. I don't think it is the duty or burden of Western enlightened powers to go around enforcing the ethos of the Declaration of Independence and the droit de l'homme by force on other countries. I'm closer to being I'm sympathetic to that point of view. I'd like to defend those values, but I think it makes for a very bad policy. I think that, the Iraq War is the ultimate example of how that goes wrong, right? And the kind of limited, much more cynical, much more transactional and instrumental policy that was the first Gulf War, right? The Scowcroft-Baker-Bush, H.W. Bush war to get Iraq out of Kuwait, because what we say goes, is, and we want this for reasons that are, they're not moral, they're not legal. They have a legal basis in the UN, but it's not that. It's about preserving the status quo and the balance of power in the Middle East and preventing the rise of a regional hegemon to protect the US's interests. And it's very self-centered, right? But what that leads to is the application of a limited use of force to achieve a very specific goal. And you can call it cynical, and it is cynical, but what it does is it limits the chaos that you create, and it leads to a successful application of military force. Yeah. So the war he didn't like, I think, was quite a good policy from a statecraft point of view. And we can debate the morality, the wisdom, but from the point of view of statecraft, it was a successful policy in pursuit of rational interests that are defensible, and it was not also
it was not open-ended. It
wasn't open-ended, and it wasn't particularly immoral. There was the highway of death, which was very bad, and there were excesses, but this is in fact going to happen in a war, and there are certainly things that to be complained about and all that, and I was not a big fan of it, but I think that it was a very successful policy on its own terms, in a way that the Iraq War that began in 2003 and has not ended, and the Afghan War, which was unavoidable but couldn't have been worse carried out. I mean, the initial phase was very good, but then you want to hang around and rule Afghanistan from Washington, you must be out of your minds, right? Or the Vietnam War before that, are all these quixotic, lunatical, kind of hegemonic, reshape the world sort of things. You couldn't achieve those results, no matter how much force you put into it, because they are unachievable goals. And anyway, but this gets us too deep in the weeds. But with the Iraq War, the Bush administration didn't agree with us of why they were doing it. There were many different reasons why, and different rankings. I once counted like 16 different reasons, and everyone had their different orders, and some, and no one had all 16. Somebody would have 4 or 5 or 8, and their priorities were always different. So there's no metric for determining success. So it is a failure by definition in advance. You see what I mean?
Right. No, absolutely. And it opens up the door for people to say, for the true believers to say, well, it didn't work out, but if we had done it this way, it would have worked out. Or if only we had done it this way, and that's a very.
But the problem is, what is the it? Right. What are you trying to achieve? And it was not the same thing. So I think for Hitchens, what he wanted at a minimum, he did kind of get, which is the empowerment of the Kurdish autonomous zone north of the 38th parallel in the KRG in Iraq. It's the closest thing the Kurds have ever had to an independent country. It's probably the closest thing that would work, because Kurdistan would be landlocked, and unless they could get basically Turkey to be the midwife of a Kurdish state, which may happen, but only in Iraq. It would, in other words, it would be non-functional to be a landlocked state surrounded entirely by enemies in Ankara, Baghdad, and Tehran, and possibly Damascus, all of them against you, and that's not viable. So, in other words, they've taken it very far. And so I think if he saw the war, which I believe he did, as first and foremost, not only by any means, but above all, a war to help to begin to make up the debt owed to the Kurdish people by the West and by the United States, that you could begin to defend it in retrospect as useful in that regard. The cost to the United States is incalculable. The cost to Iraqis is very high, and there I think it's a matter for Iraqis to ultimately decide whether they think it was a net benefit or not. And I don't think they'll be able to do that for decades and decades, because we don't know the end of the story here, right? And it might be something where like the Civil War, where you say it was an incredible sanguinary bloodbath, but it was basically a good thing, not in itself, but it was necessary. It is possible that Iraqis might look back on it and say, you know what, in the end it was necessary. I don't know. That's also not a judgment I would be willing to.
Right, but it does sometimes turn out that people say that, and that becomes the story.
The group of people, it seems to me, who can think it was a good thing. Other the Iranians were the big winners; they made out like bandits. But other than, and that was inevitable. The Iranians, apart from the Iranians, the people who might have benefited, depending on what happens in the future and how they look at it, could be the Iraqis themselves. But I think from the point of view of the United States, it was an absolute disaster. And I knew it was going to be. I was a very loud voice. I think you can still find my fulminations against the war on TV online. You can certainly see my writings, predicting bin Laden would be the winner and that there would be a huge resistance movement against the United States and insurgencies. And also, it was so obvious. I mean, I was, lots of people said this. It wasn't just me. But I had a platform on Fox and CNN and stuff to say it a lot, every few days. And I did. And I was very loudly against it. And he was very loudly for it. And it didn't make a scratch on our friendship, not a tiny dent, nothing, because we were not allies. We were not political partisans. He was not my guru. I was not his mentee. We were just buddies.
Yeah.
And we don't agree, whatever.
Right. I wonder what people, just talking about the Middle East now, I mean, I have a sense that people kind of think maybe if Biden wins, we're going to be able to kind of wake up from our nightmare and kind of look around and be like, oh, well, sorry about all that, everybody, but let's get back to business as usual. And maybe the Middle Eastern countries are going to be like, yeah, actually, sorry, we've been making our own plans.
I spent a good deal of time. I even have 2 essays about what a Biden administration policies might look like in the Middle East. And the honest truth is, I don't know. Those people who think it's going to be second-term Obama redo are wrong, because even though the basis for that is not just Biden, but the people around him who are mostly drawn from second-term Obama, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, all these people like that, some very good people, some people, whatever, mixed bag.
Yeah.
They say they've learned some lessons, and some of the lessons they say they've learned are the right ones. So we'll see if they did. But more to the point, 2021 is not going to be like 2015. It's a different world. Moreover, Trump has changed a lot of things, right? So you're going to have to deal with the legacy of Trump, which is, a lot of it has damaged the United States, but some of it's created new leverage. Like certainly Iran is in a weaker position now than it was in a certain ways, financially. It's in a bit of trouble in Iraq and elsewhere that you could leverage that. And in addition, Biden is not Obama. And it's not just every presidency is different. Every administration is different. I keep saying second-term Obama because I was so deeply into it that first-term Obama and second-term Obama were very different. And I was on really good terms with first-term Obama, and especially first 2 years, first-term Obama. I was writing continuously supportive, not of everything, but of a lot of it. And as the first term wound down, I became more and more disillusioned, and there were some big disagreements during the interregnum between the first and second term, right, the transition. And I really had very little to do with them at all during the second term, because we didn't agree at all on Syria policy. And, I did think the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran, was worth trying. And I think Trump was crazy for ripping it up. I mean, absolutely crazy. But I didn't think it was a brilliant thing. I think it was worth a shot. But it was a triumph of diplomacy in the sense of like, it was hard to do. It's good diplomacy. But policy, it's not a triumph of policy. Those are 2 different things. So I just more skeptical maybe than a lot of other people. So I make a distinction between not just different presidencies and different eras, but different administrations, because you change people. And, you have to distinguish between even within a two-term administration, the first term and the second term, are not really going to look the same. They never do.
What did you think about the assassination of Soleimani?
Um,
And what do you think Iran's going to? Do you think they're going to do? I mean, they're notoriously willing to wait and see and
yeah,
be patient, but
well, they'd still like more revenge than they've had, but I don't think it's driving their policy. I think they have ultimately got much bigger fish to fry. They've got real problems. They've got to figure a way out of these sanctions. They're really getting squeezed in Iraq. They're getting squeezed in Syria, and they've been suffering the past year. I mean, Trump has not achieved anything with regard to Iran. He hasn't achieved any goals, but he has made life difficult for them. Then he has damaged he has unified the Iranians and radicalized the Iranians so that the regime in a way is maybe strengthened, but it's impoverished and it's weaker regionally for various reasons, without any doubt at all. I mean, Hezbollah is in trouble in Lebanon and Syria. The whole thing is just not going very well for them. Now, that doesn't translate, because this is not a simple binary zero-sum world. That doesn't mean the U.S. has achieved anything, right? I mean, inflicting pain and difficulty on Iran and its allies and its proxies is not a net benefit to the United States. You have to translate that into something, which Trump has been singularly unable to do.
Yeah.
So, but my point is about Soleimani is that I think he was a legitimate target, and I think it was a perfectly okay action given. I mean, people are saying, how do we know? What's the evidence? My God, there was 1 or 2 attacks every week for the past 9 weeks on U.S. Military service people in Iraq in the weeks leading up to that attack, definitely orchestrated by him. So, I mean, I see this guy as a legitimate target. Now, the big problem I have with it is that it was done in Iraq. And I think it created real problems for the Iraqis. And I think if it could have been done anywhere else, that would have been much, much better. But I do sort of agree with Trump that Qasem Soleimani was a particularly nasty guy, a particularly dangerous guy. I don't like the whole charge towards confrontation, right? I would have stuck with the JCPOA. I would have worked with Europeans and others. I wouldn't have gone down this violent route. But it's not. For all his faults, Trump was hostile to the Iranians, but it was the Iranians who decided to go the use of force, right? He left the JCPOA in May 2018, and between May 2018 and May 2019, for a year, the Iranians tried to wait him out, and it was all sanctions and bluster on the U.S. part, and Iran trying to isolate the United States and keep the JCPOA alive. Come May 2019, after a year, clearly they realized they could not sustain this, that they had to use violence and other means to get out of the sanctions and to try to leverage the United States and force American allies like Europeans and Gulf Arabs and others to get the U.S. to back off. Right, and that was their strategy. So they started doing this. The U.S. had called a maximum pressure campaign for the sanctions. Yeah. The Iranians started talking in May 2019 about maximum resistance. They started getting all these little attacks everywhere that culminated in this big attack on the Saudi Aramco bases in processing centers in Abqaiq and Khares, and attacks on U.S. troops and facilities, and then all the missile attacks by Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, and the killing of American contractors and wounding of servicemen, and then you get the Qasem Soleimani thing, and that tit for tat is still going on. But I think people who say the U.S. is at war with Iran are wrong. I think clearly it is not a war. There is a kind of low intensity conflict, but that's not a war. And I also think that you can't blame Trump entirely for it. I say that as someone who thought he was insane to leave the JCPOA, and I think the challenge for the next administration, and it will even be Trump's challenge if he gets reelected, is somehow restarting a dialogue with Iran through the Europeans, through some of the Arab countries, etc. It's got to be done, because this maximum pressure, all it is a containment strategy, right? Iran is not going to go away. You have to come to terms with it, right? I see the JCPOA as flawed, but I don't see, if they're imagining regime change, and they insist they weren't, but insofar as they are, they're dreaming. You can't arrange a regime. This isn't 1930. You can't go to a country like Iran and bring down the regime from the outside. There'll be a regime change.
Plus, whatever inside pressures and popular movements that were kind of at odds with the regime are certainly less likely to succeed now, right?
Yes, and the various factions within the regime itself are united now because they're all being simultaneously attacked, and they have.
So we lost another Iranian generation?
Well, possibly. I mean, it's very hard to say. We don't know. It won't be up to us. It will be up to them. That's the point. You can try to push things along, but you have no idea. You might be helping, you might be hindering. You're not them, so you don't know, and only they really get to decide. And that's the great thing. So my point is that in the end, you gotta make a deal with Iran. The Arab countries have to make a deal with Iran. States need to have relations with each other, and I have a lot of problems with Iran's role in the Middle East. I do agree that they are the great destabilizing force. I do think that their policies are intolerable insofar as they support these armed militias in all these countries that have made these countries hollowed states. Lebanon is not a proper state. Iraq is not a proper state. And Iran is at the center of why they can't fix themselves, because they have these armed groups that subsume and usurp the role of the state all over the place. So, you can say Iran is taking advantage of the weakness of these states, or you can say they've created what doesn't matter. They are still operating a network of extremely malignant forces in the region. So I am not an apologist. I'm, in fact, a huge critic of the Iranians. However, ultimately, you have to make a deal with them. And yeah, the JCPOA wasn't good enough and all of that, and it left a lot of stuff out. It could and should have been a starting point. There could and should have been. The Iranians were not willing to talk about anything else, and their behavior got worse rather than better. But that doesn't mean the right approach is to rip up the treaty, ruin your relations with all your enemies, and to make enemies out of your friends, hand a bunch of victories to your rivals, and radicalize and enrage your opponent while impoverishing them and delivering them little blows that are irritating and difficult, but not debilitating or knockout or anything like that. So I just don't think anything's been achieved yet. My hope is that a Biden administration could come in and say, all right, now we want to get back on the diplomatic track. It's going to be very hard to get Iranian politicians to sit down with us. Maybe we'll go through the Europeans again. But we're not going to fail to use the leverage that Trump has created. Trump has created a lot of leverage with Iran. People talk about its maximum failure. Well, it is if you want to achieve all those goals they talked about, but I don't think that ever was going to happen, and I don't know if they're crazy enough to think it would. If your goal was to damage Iran's standing and capabilities and degrade its abilities to be a regional power, mission definitely accomplished, although it's very temporary and it's not a policy goal. It's leverage. The Trump administration has proven absolutely incapable of using that leverage. I'm hoping a Biden administration could inherit it and actually start using it diplomatically, pull away from the path to war, but from a position of strength. Get back into negotiations with Iran from a position of strength, and try to get something a little better than the JCPOA, and deal with Iran in a more serious way than the Trump administration, which is kind of hostile without a clear goal, and or the Obama administration, which entertained a fantasy that you could make a very limited deal with the Iranians, and that would empower more, I don't want to call them moderate elements, but more internationally oriented elements within the Iranian regime, and that was not true.
Do you think American power is on the wane in the region?
Of course, American power is on the wane everywhere because it reached an apogee that was ridiculous, right? I mean, the level of American power that existed globally at the end of the Cold War was historically unique. It was a unipolar moment globally. Not that the United States could do anything it wanted, not that it was omnipotent, but that it really had no rivals. Militarily, economically, culturally, it was just in a different category as everybody else. And that is not a reasonable or sustainable situation. It's not a reflection of the realities on the planet at all. It's a really weird moment.
Yeah.
And it was bound to give way to a unipolar, to a monopolar, to a multipolar. Forgive me, it's getting late. It was bound to give way to a multipolar new reality. And the problem is we are in a transition between a very long and slow and chaotic, unmanaged transition, because too many American policymakers are trying to resist rather than manage this transition.
Right.
That we are in this very delicate transition between a unipolar world and a multipolar world. We are not in a unipolar world, but we are also not in a multipolar world, unless the United States wants to cease to play the game. Now, that's happened in the Middle East to a large extent. I mean, we're still the biggest power there. We're still in very large numbers, but we just don't engage. Under Obama's second term and under Trump, we have not engaged, say, in Syria, for example. And I don't mean putting in troops and everything. I mean having skin in the game. There's just very limited ways in which the U.S. has been involved, but we haven't really tried under Obama or Trump to influence the outcome in Syria. So Russia, with very small contribution of forces and expenditure of a couple billion rubles and loss of less than 100 lives, or about 110 lives, including civilians, of their own, has managed to shape the outcome in Syria completely. And by doing that same thing that we did in 1991 in Kuwait, which is to have a very limited goal and use just as much force, whether it's diplomatic, economic, military, whatever kind of force it is, to achieve that goal, and don't go any further. And if it doesn't work, don't freak out. Just let it go and move on to the next thing. In other words, don't be crazy. Don't be hubristic about this. Just try some stuff and use what your force can. They have really reasserted themselves in the region in a way that they haven't had, a role they haven't had since 1973, which is a long time. And it's really nothing to do, and they're everyone's interlocutor, right? Everyone wants to talk to the Russians. Right?
Yeah.
It's just because in many cases, we're nowhere to be found.
Okay.
And, I think we left a vacuum and they walked right in. And even though they're really sort of a third-rate power, they're willing to play and they're willing to do and they're willing to talk and they're ruthless. And, I think that the Syrian war that they've pursued is an incredible crime against humanity. But I see what they wanted to do and why, and it's very instructive they were able to do it. Obama gave these interviews to Jeff Goldberg and people like that several times in his last 2 years, where he would say things like, the Russians have been sucked into Syria. They'll bleed to death. They'll never survive. It's a disaster. It's a catastrophe. No, Obama, Ben Rhodes, and a few of the other people in his administration got it in their heads that every foreign engagement in the Middle East is always going to be Iraq 2003.
Yeah,
they forgot entirely about Kuwait 1991. They forgot entirely about the idea that you don't have to be Don Quixote chasing windmills and this crazy trying to reshape cultures and do all this crazy stuff, but that you could actually have a successful engagement, and that ideally it should not involve any military force, but that you do have to have skin in the game and you do have to have leverage. And they just concluded this is a horrible quagmire from which nothing any good can come. And they thought the Russians were crazy for getting involved in Syria. And I hope they were paying attention to Putin showing that, for all the ruthlessness of it and brutality of it, yet he didn't have to be that ruthless. He did achieve a very limited result, which is not Assad's control of all of Syria, but Assad's control of what they call necessary Syria, with Russian dominance to protect their military bases and their interests and their allies and their friends, whatever. And that this was done with a very low loss of Russian life and a very small expenditure of Russian money compared to the Iraq War, which has bled our country dry and made Americans exhausted and very cynical about a foreign engagement.
Well, that's good. I mean, that's a good tour through a few countries there, and that's I like that, because I feel like we do have these lessons in our heads in America, starting with going into Iraq, or whether or not it was good or not, and then the lessons that we supposedly learned after being there, it wasn't good, and they're simple, they're not detailed.
They are simple, but we are a binary people.
Yeah.
Our culture, I mean, not Americans individually, but our political culture on foreign policy tends to swing from one extreme to the other. We tend to go from hubristic imperial adventures that are crazy to neo-isolationism. Right. And then we go back to hubristic lunacy, and then we run back inside our shell. And that balance is not there. And it's particularly difficult in the post-Cold War era, because during the Cold War, the mainstream liberal and conservative factions agreed on the Cold War. They didn't want any war with the Russians, but then they did want to pursue containment and sort of oppose the Russians and the Soviet Union and Marxism in general. So there was a guiding framework, a generally accepted kind of goal: avoid war but try and prevail. And it gave U.S. policy a consistency between administrations and a coherence that it has absolutely lacked since the Soviet Union has collapsed. And it's getting worse and worse, especially now that we have a neo-isolationist president, or a president with strong isolationist tendencies. And you can see it's the public drives this, by the way, because almost every time since Bill Clinton, the candidate who has wanted less international engagement has defeated the one that wants more. And if Biden wins, this will be the first time since Clinton defeated George W. Bush that the candidate who wants more international engagement has won. That's a big record. I mean, Clinton beat Bush, and then Clinton beat, who was the second one he beat? Yeah, exactly. And then you had, George W. Bush, who beat Gore, right? And then George W. Bush beat Kerry, and then you had Obama, right, beating was McCain, and every time, right, it has been the candidate who has wanted less engagement, and I think we may be on the brink of a deviation, but only because Trump is such a hideous ogre.
Yeah, right. It might take that to.
Yeah, I think it takes. I do think so. I think, in other words, here's what I would say. I'm sort of for engagement, though I'm not a militarist at all. Yeah. Certainly not a neoconservative by any manner of means. I'm a critic of theirs, but I am an internationalist fundamentally. I think that the foreign policy elite in this country, the foreign policy constituency, the group of people that follow this stuff, who generally tend to be internationalists of one kind or another, there is a growing isolationist constituency on the left and the right, and they come together to form this new think tank, the Quincy Institute, which is far left and far right together arguing for, like, get out of the world and whatever, which is weird. And it's funded by Koch and Soros, which is a very strange combination, but it shows where these things are coming from, right? Yeah. So, but still, it's a fringe. It's a combination of two fringes. You needed to put the two fringes together to make something viable, and it's still fringy, very fringy. But what the foreign policy community has not done is explain to ordinary Americans why it's a good idea. The ordinary Americans have in the post, there was a rationale during the Cold War that people could understand, but it's been lost. And so now ordinary people all over the country tend to look at this as an intolerable burden and a damned imposition and an outrage and a mistake, and screw them, and that is a very dumb attitude. But people came by it honestly, not just because of these insane, endless wars and very stupid policies, but also because the community, the constituency that follows foreign policy, has not explained to them in convincing terms that they have accepted, that has been understandable and convincing.
Yeah.
That is in their interest. I don't think that was impossible. I think
it's hard to be concise on that, isn't it? I mean, to make that case concisely.
But I think there is a point at which, there's a lack of effort. Yeah. And there's this idea that, well, we will decide and you guys will shut up, and B, there's an elitism.
Leave it to us anyway.
You can't explain it to these people. They're just too dumb. They're too interested in basketball and football, and they don't understand anything. And the Kardashians and Queer Eye, and they don't know anything. I mean, this is wrong. This is wrong-headed. It leads to Trumpism in foreign policy. It leads to big mistakes. And I think ordinary Americans can be forgiven for their fatigue. That, first of all the stuff they think about the outside world is what they've been told by leaders in the media and demagogues. And so they didn't invent it themselves. They've heard all of this from it. The other thing is that they've had to endure and pay the price for things like the Iraq War and the way the Afghan War was done. And all the stupid stuff that so they don't believe in the elites, because the elites have made these mistakes. So someone like Trump can come along, and he has a pig's breakfast of policy. He doesn't even do policy, actually. He does only politics, right? His ideas are all based on what will look good for me tonight on. Right. And he thinks in 12-hour cycles, right? Or 8-hour cycles, not more than 12 hours. I mean, it's just, and he goes from one thing to, because he doesn't believe anything except himself. And so policy doesn't enter into it, because outcomes are not important unless they're his political outcomes or financial outcomes. Nothing else matters. So policy is not a conceptual framework. I mean, there is always a conflict between politics and policy, because there are policy goals, but politicians need the politics to stay in power. So there's always that tension, right? That's inevitable. But here we have a leader who has no policy, just politics. And it's kind of an amazing thing, right? But he can justify his political non-policies by saying, oh, those are the idiots who took us into Iraq. These are the fools. The generals are, he's the biggest armor of the military possible. And yet he rails against the military-industrial complex. He's the big macho guy, but he condemns generals for wanting wars. And none of it makes any sense. But he can touch those nerves that are still very exposed, and they're real nerves, and they're serious nerves, and they hurt. And it sounds like he's an outsider who has seen through the BS and has got their number. And none of it's remotely true, but a good con man, which is what he is a good con man.
he is, and he is very good. I mean, you watched him knock out one at a time in the primaries 4 years ago. These career politicians, and doing it with relish.
And then Hillary Clinton, and took her down. And it's by no means certain that Biden will win, but I will say this: Biden's lead has been amazingly stable, right? I haven't ever seen this, that where one candidate has a lead very early in the campaign and does not relinquish it until a few weeks out. I have not seen that. I really have not seen that. And, there's the possibility of future events. There's the possibility of shy Trump voters who just don't tell people what they think. Yeah. There's, all kinds of shenanigans going on with voting and cheating and God knows what. But I think right now it looks like Trump is in big, big trouble. And today was his worst day, as I said before. In addition to the Woodward stuff, There's the whistleblower with his big DHS complaint saying that not only were they told to downplay Russian interference and play up Chinese and Iranian, even though it's, there's no comparison, because it's good for Trump. They were also told to greatly downplay the domestic terrorism threat of white supremacist groups because these are allies of the president. This is an extremely bad thing, in addition to which Mike Pence, it's been revealed, is going to a QAnon shindig in.
What was that? Is that I only just saw that as a headline.
So it's some kind of fundraising event in Montana that is being hosted by a couple of QAnon lunatics. And Mike Pence is going to go there and kiss and whatever. And this is not, and you've got the QAnon candidates like this green woman in Georgia. And, the party is just going insane.
Yeah. And
I think that the country is not in a QAnon frame of mind. And, Trump seems to think it's 1968. And he can, that he can talk about the black people coming into the suburbs and it's Southie in 1965 and he's Louise Day Hicks. And this is not where the country is anymore. Well,
you wrote a column about that, right?
I did.
You I'll link to that where you say that you think like this idea of Trump kind of blustering about being the law and order guy isn't going to work.
I don't, because mainly because this is not going to be a law and order or race or culture or immigration, which are all his issues. Law and order, though, he's the most lawless guy ever, but he means beat up on working class criminals, and especially black people or Latino, non-white people, but even, white people he doesn't like, whatever. There's a class thing as well as a race thing and an urban thing. But more importantly, none of those things are what this election is going to be about. Perforce, it's a healthcare and jobs election. It has to be, given the pandemic and the recession. It has to be. And he hasn't got a leg to stand on those two things. Meanwhile, he's being hammered with this military stuff, these revelations by Goldberg, with this COVID stuff from Woodward, and there's more to come. I don't think the Cohen book hurts him. I think a lot of stuff doesn't hurt him. Yeah. But trashing the military dead, that hurts.
I agree that different. That feels different.
Also, lying to the public about COVID, saying to Woodward, it's a terrible thing, it's very dangerous, it's deadly, and then going on 3 weeks later telling the public it's going away, it's less than the flu. People are not going to like this.
It also pulls the rug out from people who also, because of Trump, think that COVID isn't a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So now they're gonna have to ask themselves. They won't, because there's a cult. Well, there are a couple things. First of all, there's this whole cult mentality where contrary evidence just does not go through, it becomes strictly irrational, right? The other thing is that a lot of his followers look at him as a tribal leader, as a defender of their identity, and as a kind of racial ethnic leader, a chieftain, and insofar as that goes, policies and outcomes are irrelevant. He's your guy, and it just really doesn't matter. Right. The evangelicals, this thing that Cohen wrote about, oh, can you believe that bullshit? They actually believe that bullshit. They don't care if that's what
they don't believe it either. Some
of them do and some of them don't. But the point is, they don't care if he believes it or not. They are convinced he is their guy, and they don't care if he's a gangster. He's their gangster. They don't care if he's a criminal. He's their criminal. And as long as they think he's with them, none of this is going to, I think it's all going to bounce off for that constituency. The problem is that constituency is not a winning coalition. He needed to add others, and in my view, he's losing them in big numbers. He has some surprising things. He has something like a quarter of the Hispanic vote in the country.
There's a few things.
That's not surprising to me because there is no such thing as a Hispanic vote. Like Spanish language origins is not a unifying factor. This is just fantasy. This is not a community. This is not even an ethnic group. This is just it is a category invented in the Nixon administration that is meaningless, right? And, there are people who will go with him anyway because they hate the Democrats. My sense is that he has not figured out a way to form a winning coalition, and he's probably either something dramatic is going to happen, and I don't know what, that's good for him rather than bad for him, or he's going to have to cheat and contest the results and litigate and try and create violence, and I expect that. My last column, which was published the weekend, I like many other people, have speculated it will require something. It may require a color revolution in the United States to get this guy out. And Hitchens would have been a very big, good part of that if he were with us.
Absolutely. Well, I greatly appreciate the amount of time you spent talking to us tonight. And yeah, that's good. I really appreciate it. It was very interesting.
Sure.
I wanted in the last minute to just bring up one last thing I forgot to mention, was that you mentioned in One Last Lunch that you talked about, politics and so on, but you also discussed literature and bonded over literature. And I just wonder what you bonded over most.
Okay, so the Woodhouse we both loved and knew intimately, but I'll tell you when I think I really got into his inner circle kind of permanently, and it was a literature thing. He described something as being more honored in the breach than in the observance, and he used it in the sense of that it is more often not done than done, right? In other words, well, they say they should do that, but it's more honored in the breach than in the observance. Yeah. And I said, where that comes from? He said, yes, Hamlet. I said, that's right. And then I said, but it doesn't mean what you're saying. It means it's more honorable not to do it than to do it. It doesn't mean it's more normal that's usually not done. It means it would be better if it weren't done. And he said, no, it doesn't. And I said, yeah, it does. He said, no, it doesn't. I said, well, where's Shakespeare? He said, over there somewhere. I went and got the thing. I went to the thing. I know this play very well, and it's on the battlements in the very early scene. Hamlet's talking to Horatio. They're on the battlement waiting for the ghost, and they hear the drums and the cannons in the distance. And I said, what's that? And he says, it's the king drinking wine, and the cannons and the drums trumpet his triumph as he washes his draught of Rhenish down. It's wassail. Every time he finishes a cup, they boom, boom, boom. And then Hamlet starts trashing on him. He doesn't like Claudius, and he thinks he's an idiot. And he says, Horatio says it a custom. And Hamlet says, I marry, 'tis, but it were more honored in the breach than in the observance, and other countries clap us drunkards, and it derives from our opinion. So the point is, yeah, they do it all the time, but it would be much more honorable if they didn't do it. More honored in the breach than in the observance. If they didn't do it, it would be more honorable. And I showed him that. And he said, and there was this long silence. And he looked at me and he said, you can stay. I think I had him there because I think it's unusual to teach Hitch something about Shakespeare.
Yeah, and he was more than happy to, once he realized he was wrong.
Well, he didn't push back on me. I mean, it was there. It was. It was not saying it's more right. Well, it's not saying it was more often not done than done. It was saying it's dishonorable to do it, and it would be more honorable to breach the custom than to do the custom.
Well, I think
an example of bonding over literature.
I think that's great. I think one of the Hitch maxims that I think about a lot was when he said, and he said many times, that it's not so much what you think, is how you think.
Yeah, I think that, well, that's Hitchens completely, because he was not, I mean, we talked a lot about how he viewed the world and his certain consistencies within his inconsistencies, but I actually always saw him, insofar as I took inspiration from the guy, as an example, which I did. I admired him. I was not my guru. I was not his mentee, but I did admire him. I did appreciate him. And what I appreciated was not his positions necessarily, or his policy prescriptions, or his, views on this. It was his style. His style, not just of speaking, but his way of thinking. His way, not the conclusions,
No.
but the whole process by which he thought about things.
Yeah.
Very, very sophisticated, very cultured, very clever, very funny, very wry, very rich, very human, full of compassion and decency. And so even if he's wrong, he almost always was wrong for a good reason. So he was wrong on Iraq, but he was wrong for the only reason that you could really justify being wrong, which is to say that ultimately this is all that other stuff is just so much hooey. I want to help the Kurds. This will help the Kurds. Therefore, I'm going to be for it.
Yeah. All right. Well, Hussein, I appreciate you talking to us for 2 hours and counting, and it's been great. I like to talk to you again, maybe at some point.
Sure.
But,
I'm happy to do it, but I got to finish my Bloomberg column before I go to sleep. So.
All right. We'll look out for it, and we'll link to it too.
It'll be out probably tomorrow or the next day, depending on the editors. But
Very good.
See how they like it. Anyway. All right.
Have a good night.
Thank you
very much.